All good.
Awesome.
All right. Kyle, thanks for joining me here today. I'd love to take a little bit of time today to try to support some of the parents of athletes. Personally, I've been spending a lot of the time over the last couple of weeks with athletes, but I think the parents are a really important piece of the puzzle. So I wondered if we could start with maybe just talking about how, from your standpoint, you feel that the parent can best support the athlete, during this time that we're in, particularly over the coming weeks here. And I would say, particularly in the context of sport, and obviously there's lots of ties between sport and life, but if we can talk about things such as I'm finding with athletes now, motivation is changed a lot, right? For most of our athletes, they're not in the context of sport at all. They're having to almost create sport within the confines of their house in some capacity. And also, I mean, they're very removed from sport, on a professional level. And so I wondered if you can kind of maybe start off our discussions with that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's probably three things come to mind for me. The first thing that comes to mind for me is I think it's natural for parents. So me being a parent also of a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old who are cooped up in a house for about 22 of 24 hours now. That can be difficult to manage. Like even for the most mindful and of us who have the best self-regulation skills and ability to manage our emotions and be present and be empathetic and compassionate. Even for those who have those skills in spades, it still becomes a challenge because there's just likely more. There's more opportunity for friction between family right now. That's just kind of the reality of it. So I think I would start by suggesting the importance of reflecting on self-care for parents. Like, how do we make sure as parents that we continue to prioritize some of the self-care strategies that are so important for our well-being? I think some parents have a pretty good idea of what that is and what that looks like for them. Like a lot of people, I would say, especially those who are performers in and of themselves, depending on what their career paths are, they're going to have probably certain morning routines or evening routines or exercise routines that are really important to their well-being. And I think it's important to make sure that we carve out time to prioritize that, especially in days like we were talking earlier, where you can sleep in a little bit later and you don't necessarily have to do the same things you were doing before. So the structure loosens up a little bit. So how can we still maintain a sense of structure and organization when the conditions around us are loosening up and allowing for maybe us to slip a little bit more? So that'd be number one. The second piece to this is for me, is the cognitive bias piece. So cognitive biases or unhelpful thinking styles, I refer to them sometimes as thinking traps. It's these built-in programs that our brains have created through evolution to help us make sense of the abundance of information and stimuli available to us moment by moment. We can't possibly process everything that's going on. So our brains have created these little strategies to help us kind of fill in the blanks. So that allows us basically in a moment where, let's say we're walking down the street and we see somebody we recognize. They don't look at us, they don't wave. We only have maybe 2 or 3 pieces of information that we're actually consciously taking in, and our brain fills in the blank. And usually it fills in the blank by using strategies like wondering, well, did I do something wrong to that person? Are they upset with me? Are they annoyed with me? When in the reality, they likely just didn't see you, or maybe they were lost in thought. So there's a few different common thinking traps: future telling, mind reading, catastrophizing, I would say overgeneralization. There's a lot of great resources that I can recommend. Maybe at the end, you can provide some links to some of the parents to inform themselves a little bit about these. The key is, though, in these moments of challenge and adversity, these thinking traps are on overdrive. They're trying to help us process all of the unknowns that are present in our environment. There are so many unknowns right now, and our brain is designed to try to understand and make sense of everything. That's where we find our comfort. Unfortunately, in moments when we're trying to make sense of all of these unknowns, our brain is capitalizing on all of these faulty systems that are creating these perspectives that are often distorted and that create these feelings and these worries and these anxieties that are not necessarily well founded.
So what would you say, Kyle, would be, I think from what I'm hearing is, it sounds like the first step with all of this is understanding or being aware that we have these cognitive biases. Then I would say to you, it would be, what would be step two once I'm now in the moment and can be aware that this thinking trap has come up? What would you say would be step two to sort of unwind that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think there would be two different approaches depending on if it was the parent trying to understand his or her own cognitive biases, or
Mhm.
whether the parent is trying to help his or her child process and maybe not succumb to these pitfalls.
Okay.
So it's a lot easier for us to see these thinking traps being enacted in others, right? So it's easy for us to listen to our kids and our wives say things that we know are maybe they lack a little bit of rational thought or logic. So it's pretty easy for us to point those out and say, oh, like ask questions about, really, is that what you think? Like, that's interesting. Like, what leads you to believe that? You know, so you're worried that, for example, if you don't swing a golf club in 2 months, that you're going to completely lose all of your skill set, right? So, for example, the cognitive bias of catastrophizing. Why do you think that? Have you gone 2 months before without swinging a golf club, and how did that actually go for you? So then trying to get the person to reflect on real experience or logic or rational thinking. These cognitive biases often come from a place, again, that are deep within sort of the primal areas of the brain that are impacted more by emotion than they are by reason. So if we can help the athletes reason their way through these faulty thoughts and these faulty perspectives, what that does, it allows them to reshape them a little bit, make them a little bit more accurate. They represent reality a little bit more. And usually when it represents reality a little bit more, it's going to soften the edges of the emotional feelings or the states that might be creating the anxiety and the worries.
Mm-hmm. And I love as well, Kyle, the idea with, from a parent standpoint, when dealing with their athlete, that they're really coming at the interaction from a non-judgmental state. I guess when I was hearing you speak about that, your last little point there, that was the big thing that stood out to me, is the parent asking very sort of open-ending, inquisitive type, self-reflective questioning to help the athlete kind of shift their perspective on something. I think from my standpoint as a coach, I operate from the exact same framework, that we're trying to have that athlete be the one that discovers this new perspective, as opposed to the coach or the parent sort of imparting their thoughts on it, which often gets tossed up with some resistance. And then now you're really just kind of adding to that emotional state that maybe isn't as functional as it could be, you know?
Well, absolutely. And again, I'm sure everybody that's going to listen to this is going to, at this moment, say, well, yeah, that's a lot easier said than done. And absolutely, it's easier said than done. Are we going to misstep, and are we going to make these sort of blanket statements and pass judgments on some of the things that we hear coming out of our children or the people around us? Absolutely. It's going to happen a lot less, though, when we find ourselves in places of greater well-being and greater stability and greater mindfulness. That's why I think it does start with that first piece of really making sure that we are taking care of ourselves first, so that we bring the version of ourselves that's able to do these things that are often quite tricky under the circumstances that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. One of the strategies, Kyle, I think personally that I've used a lot in my interactions with my son over the last little while, which I think would be really helpful for a lot of the other parents, is different down-regulating strategies. I find most of the time when I'm not in a really good state, I found that my level of activation goes up based on maybe an interaction with my son, or he's frustrated and my energy is sort of rising. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and certain strategies where, you know, the parent can kind of almost like bring themselves down, or I consider it like a reset. And that's typically how I see it myself and have referred to it in the past, to help them maybe shift their own state in that moment when they might realize that, hey, this conversation and how I feel right now isn't really making me feel good.
Yeah, so I think, I could easily point to 2 or 3 basic sort of relaxation strategies, or centering strategies. But the truth is, what I've learned is, it's really important that these strategies become individualized for the person. Meaning,
Mhm.
my first suggestion would be, develop a really good understanding of what you are, how you act, how you feel, what you think in moments where you feel grounded and you feel relaxed and calm and in control of yourself. Like, I would start by trying to get that person to understand what that actually looks like. And then I would try to see whether or not there's a critical piece there. Is it specifically a physical way of being? Is it specifically a feel? Is it actually a tone of voice or a type of energy that people bring to the communication? And then based on that, then we would probably look to create sort of tailored strategies. So just being real specific here, let's say in moments where people feel themselves getting kind of that, let's say tightened a little bit and activated or a little bit overly activated because of something that they're facing. It could even just be background noise, right? Like maybe they spent the whole day at the computer on calls and it's been a stressful day and they don't even know to what degree that they're actually wound up. And then all of a sudden their child comes in, they ask a question that seemingly is harmless, or maybe it is a little bit sharp. And then all of a sudden that instinct, without necessarily realizing it, is to jump and to maybe act in a way that's not necessarily aligned with how they want to. In
Mhm.
that moment, I would ask the person, well, if there's one thing that you could do that would move you closer to being the version of you that's in control, what would that be? And for some people, it might be, okay, I just need to do a sort of physical scan and a little physical check and make sure I'm releasing some of the tension in my shoulders, releasing some of the tension in my jaw, relaxing my hands and my fingers a little bit. And if I take 10 seconds to do that, that's going to allow me to at least soften my state a little bit to the point where I'm probably going to be able to engage more appropriately. Other people might say, you know what, I actually need to slow down my heart rate. I'm going to take a few real deep, sort of slow and controlled breaths. Other people might say it's more cognitive, where my thoughts are all over the place. I actually just need to find a way to control and center my thoughts on something. I'm going to ask myself a really simple check-in question of, what version of myself do I want to bring to this conversation? And just that little quick cognitive check-in might allow the person to center their thoughts on one clear intention.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Kyle. And from my standpoint, as I hear you speak about that, I think the interconnectedness of those 3 different sort of strategies, what's happening with the mind, the body, and the physiological reactions that are coming from those, I think is really cool to tap into. I think from my experience, I found when I go at the physiology standpoint, more of your suggestion around a body scan as an example, or starting to really recognize, like, where in my body do I feel like I'm holding this tension, and again, from my standpoint too, checking in to say it just feels like, physiologically feels like things are moving quickly. So I've often used different breathing techniques to try to kind of slow things down. And I guess from my standpoint, that would be when I'm at my best. I feel like things are moving at a little bit of a slower pace. But to your point, I think it's really good that parents got to kind of figure out what works best for them. And starting to tap into that key awareness, which you and I always go back to, is the framework of all of this, is just this understanding of self, particularly when you are at these states where you feel good, and maybe what's going on when you're not.
Well, that's it. And this awareness piece, it really is so key. So at 2 levels, right? Awareness of at the trait level, meaning awareness of self and who you are and what your strengths and what your weaknesses are, what your common potholes are, pitfalls or triggers, and then awareness at the state level. So moment by moment awareness. Those 2 pieces are so important. And one thing I'll just say, going back to like the strategies, those 3 strategies, for example, are for these moments where literally the person is in front of you and you're trying to downregulate in an instant. But if you have more than an instance to downregulate, let's say you have 5 to 10 minutes, or you're finishing up your day and you know that supper's going to be ready in 30 minutes, and you have 15 minutes to maybe transition from work to family, which is a little bit more difficult given the actual physical spaces right now being stuck at home. This is where maybe you can use more elaborate strategies like, I'm going to go for a walk and I'm going to put my headphones on and I'm going to listen to a couple songs that I know just make me feel better. I'm going to get a little oxygen. I'm going to get a little bit of physical activity. Maybe my breathing is going to naturally slow itself down as I start to walk. Maybe all of a sudden I'm going to have a little bit of a smile on my face because of the music I'm listening to. Maybe I might even jump in a shower and have a really quick hot shower, just clean myself off a little bit. That's always pretty relaxing. Whatever the more elaborate strategy might be, given the time frame that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. No, those are great ones, and certainly ones that I've used as well. And I think you hit the nose on the head with understanding what sort of a reset do you need. Do you need a mini one where all I need right now is maybe just a small shift, or have I gotten to the point where, I might need something a little bigger to get me back into my state? And again, I feel from my standpoint, it comes back to self-awareness. Can I tune into at that moment, what do I truly need? And then you might not necessarily know the answer, but at least having some tools to start to, I find, to unwind it a little bit, super helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think the comment you just said, Jeff, is maybe the most important thing of the whole conversation at this point. Is you said maybe you don't know what you need, and that is often the case. The vast majority of clients that I work with, and athletes and parents and coaches, they start from a place of not knowing exactly what they need. So that becomes a really important starting place where it might take you, let's say a week of spending 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day reflecting or making notes or journaling or just talking through it with your partner about, what do you see in me when I start to get a little bit overactivated? What does that look like? Like, if your partner is telling you maybe you should go for a walk, that's probably a pretty good indicator that you're presenting certain symptoms or signs that people are noticing, and maybe you don't have the sort of awareness sensitivity to pick up on it just quite yet. But that's such a key starting place that we just don't want to overlook. And that's why I was so quick to avoid providing these blanket strategies, because often those have limited impact if it's not something that resonates with the person.
Mm-hmm. One of the core skills you talked about there that I often talk about with the athletes is the idea of journaling and self-reflection. So I think the second layer to all of this, for you to be able to incorporate some of these strategies and these awarenesses, is to be able to reflect back on, okay, well, what was the scenario today where maybe I wasn't at my best? Did I use a strategy to try to shift my awareness or my attention? And then how did that go? And I find, from my standpoint, just that process, whether it be something formal like actually physically writing it down, or more just a internal check-in at the end of the day, I find is huge for learning. Because really, a lot of what we're talking about is no different than the skills that the athletes are learning in terms of technical or physical skills. This is like a core mental, emotional regulation skill that needs to go through that same learning process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important that we don't put all mental, emotional skills on the same level. I think that's what often happens is we suggest, here's a dozen mental skills and we're going to treat them as being all equal, or we can treat them in ways that we can learn them all at the same rate. And that's not the way it works. It's no different than physical skills. There are prerequisites, certain fundamental movement skills that are required for athletes to develop before they get into more complex skills. And it's the same thing with mental skills or emotional skills, where, we're talking about trying to, in the moment, monitor, be aware, and regulate certain states that aren't aligned with the way we want to act and maybe our intentions. Those are next level skills. There are prerequisite skills to being able to do those successfully. And the prerequisite skills would be, again, that trait awareness that probably, in my research, can only come from probably three places. Number one, mindfulness training, meditation. Number two, having a peer or a mentor, a critical friend to help guide you in sort of deeper levels of reflection and thinking. And number three is that journaling piece, where in the absence of having someone to guide you through questions, you actually sit down and force your thoughts out onto paper and maybe ask yourself these critical questions that then you take time to sort of dive deep into.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of conclude here, I can't stress enough some of the strategies that we've talked about today from a parenting standpoint I find such a big impact on the performance of the athlete, which really at the end of the day, I know from a parent standpoint, you're just trying to, support your athlete in the best possible way to help them with achieving their best self. So there's multiple layers here. We've talked about a lot of strategies that can help you as an individual, but please understand that this is a big piece that can help performance from your child, and all of the themes really from my standpoint as a coach are transcending the athlete and the parent. So we would, have the exact same discussion with your son or daughter, and there'd be a lot of very similar themes to them,
Yeah, and I love the fact that you just kind of, you created that bridge between these skills that are being used within this conversation in the context of how are we managing our current realities given what's going on around us. But the only thing that changes is the context and the trigger. The skills remain the same, whether you're on the golf course and you hit your driver sideways. Just the context and the trigger changes, but our same biases kick in. Our need to on an ongoing basis monitor our thoughts and our states and downregulate. It's all the same. Our way of being doesn't change. Just the context and the situation in which we be changes.
Mm-hmm. And what a unique opportunity here, and this is what I've been talking about with the athletes a lot over the last little while, is to see how we can take this challenging time or a bit of an obstacle and come out of it with some skills that we can really use to our benefit in the future. So now, hopefully by the time we get into the summer and you're with your son or daughter in the landscape of competition, think of what you've got in your toolbox now to deal with these different situations that, to Kyle's point, are going to pop up. Some obviously may be a little more impactful or more difficult to deal with than others, but we're bringing ourselves around with, everywhere we go. So that's how I've kind of been, it's this shift in mindset around, no, I'm going to really develop some cool skills here that can be helpful. So thanks, Kyle, for connecting sort of the performance or sport landscape with a lot of what we're talking about, because I do agree that they're very closely tied. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Kyle. Your insights are obviously very beneficial, and I think will help any of the parents that are watching this. So thank you for that, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much. My pleasure. You too.
All right. Thanks, Kyle.